This is Nate Miller. We are in the Bronx Hall lobby, and it is November 29th at 12:30 p.m., and I am interviewing Lynn Miller.
Hello.
So first off, could you tell me where and when you were born?
I was born November 22nd, 1962, in Marquette, Michigan.
And so today we are interviewing about the Vietnam War and what role you had in it. So if you could tell us how old you were during the war and what you did.
I was approximately 6 years old through 10 to 12, depending upon when you considered the official ending of the Vietnam War was.
Okay.
My role was I was a little kid playing in the suburb of Chicago, Illinois, and then Kansas City area.
All right. So on to our first question. What were you doing prior to the war starting, or prior to your awareness of the war?
I was being a little kid playing with cars and trucks.
Okay. Um, so based on what you knew, what was your understanding of why the U.S. was involved in Vietnam?
I pretty much at that age had no recollection of it. I knew some people from our neighborhood in Chicago were gone, but again, I was just a little kid. I really wasn't cognizant of larger issues unless I saw it on TV.
Okay. So before the war, did you know anything about North and South Vietnam, or?
That would be a no. I did not.
Okay. Um, so we've already asked that one. Did you learn or receive information about the war, and if you did, at any time throughout your life, does this change your perspective of the war or your understanding of the war?
Well, most definitely, it changed my perspective. Again, as a kid, I did read newspaper. That was the main source of news back then.
Okay.
Or I looked at the pictures until I could learn to read, and then we did watch news on TV. Uh, Back when Walter Cronkite was on CBS, that was my dad's and my mom's favorite newscaster. So I was aware of what was going on, but I would say my opinion of the Vietnam War didn't really solidify until after I was out of college, and I gave it some more thought.
Okay, and then how did that change? How did your opinion change after college?
My opinion changed that we were trying very hard to stop a military dictatorship coming down from the north with North Vietnam. But I also realized that the U.S. was not innocent in any of the transgressions and wrongdoings by any way. Cambodia and Laos were very, very bloody areas, and we used the native populations to our benefit. And thankfully for us, they just kind of took it in stride. But that's a very contentious issue, using the other countries to our benefit.
Okay. Um, so do you have any specific experiences from the war era that you can't forget, or of most vivid memory?
I would say not until afterwards. My middle sister, Patricia, we called her Patty, then we called her Trish. Her first husband handled Agent Orange on the docks in San Francisco before they were sent over to become part of the napalm bombing that the U.S. did.
Okay.
And even just handling it, he ended up later in life with a storage of Agent Orange in his adipose tissues or his fat tissues, and he did not realize it until he was in very good shape, and he ended up getting severely sick from just handling it. But when he went to the VA hospital in Kansas City, they did take care of all of his medical bills um, retrospectively, and then while he was getting the treatment. So it had gone undetected in his body for, I'd say, close to 20 years.
Oh, okay. And then So your views on how the soldiers were treated, goes along with it. Did they get proper care during and after the war, or how did you see that as going on?
I have no firsthand knowledge of that, but based upon readings of firsthand accounts, and then the old proverbial Vietnam War movies like Apocalypse Now and what have you, they seem to be treated fairly. But it wasn't a situation where they could pull a 9 to 5 shift and call it a day. They were on guard 24/7 until they were relieved from their duties. Afterwards, I think the U.S. probably tried to make amends with those soldiers, like my ex brother in law, but they didn't make it very well known. They wanted to keep it kind of under the carpet, so to speak.
Okay. And then, based on your experiences from the war and then after the war, could you explain the war in one word? And then, would you elaborate on why you chose this word?
First word that came to mind was brutal. Um, Based upon the atrocities committed by both sides, the U.S. is in no way innocent. Um, it was jungle warfare at its worst. We had some of that in the Korean War. From what my father has told me, he was not part of that, but jungle warfare really did not come into play until Vietnam, in my mind, and that was kill or be killed, and it was very brutal. The Viet Cong and their allies from the north were extremely adept at handling battle in the jungle,
Okay.
and they knew how to use the jungle to their advantage. So the U.S. was on its back foot until they could get caught up, and they did have to play some underhanded, dirty tactics, like I mentioned, with using the Cambodians and the Laos troops to our advantage.
Okay. And then, based on what you knew as a child at the time, once the war was over, did life return to normal, or were some things different? And did they change permanently, or were those changes temporary?
Life for me didn't change. I was a kid. I was playing in the streets, playing football under the street lights. Uh, we moved aside when the cars came along, but staying out late, doing what little homework I had as a kid, and anxiously awaiting summer so we could play football and baseball all summer. But as I got older, in high school, as part of a current events class, we did spend a little bit of time on the Vietnam War and its effects. Um, I'd say it went back for the general public. It went back to as normal as possible, but for those affected, um, this was before we actually knew what post-traumatic stress syndrome was,
Okay.
and I really think that the Vietnam vets suffered hugely from the devastating effects of the war afterwards.
And did those Vietnam veterans that suffered, did they ever get any retribution that you know of, or were they treated differently after years of so-called neglect, if there was any neglect by the U.S. government?
Um, Treated better by the government with um, monetary gains, I guess, in retrospect. They might have, but it took a tremendous amount of effort on their part,
The veterans part?
the veterans' part, and lobbying by organizations such as the POW MIA group, which you still see flags flying around.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, excuse me. Um, but I think there always was a stigma in general society regarding the Vietnam veterans when they came back. They were almost treated like second-class citizens, which was not good in my mind.
And do you have any inclination as to why they were treated as second-class citizens?
Um, I think part of that was because the Vietnam War was a war which the general public did not want us in, and we kind of got thrust into it to keep stability in the Southeast Asia theater, so to speak. And because of that, the general public, there was a split. Those that were for that because they knew the larger issues, and those that knew those larger issues but still did not think it fair for us to send our own young men and women into a battle halfway around the world that really didn't have any effect on us.
Okay. Okay. And then, based on what you know afterwards, is there anything you think we could have done differently during the war?
I think we, I think initially we as a country, the military aspect didn't really take it seriously. They thought it would be a short-term war, and we'd be able to go in and flex our muscles and get the job taken care of. But then once they realized that it was such an entrenched war with jungle warfare, that they realized they had to up their forces. So I guess in retrospect, I think if we had gone in there with the attitude of let's get this over with as soon as possible, we would have sent the right number of manpower and the right amount of equipment to get it taken care of within a year or two and not have it drag out the way it did.
Okay. And then a question is, what lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time in history?
What lessons did I learn? Again, that probably would have been post college. I kind of went through life up until college of just a laissez-faire attitude, but post college, do you repeat the question?
What lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time in history?
Okay, what lessons? I think the fact that anytime we get into a war, which unfortunately happens somewhat often, we absolutely need to take it seriously from the get-go. And if we are there for a greater good to, like for Vietnam, quell communism in that area, then we need to make sure we do it right the first time and not just kind of piecemeal it. I guess another lesson would be don't let things get that far. There are things we could have done, I think, in Vietnam, as in Afghanistan and Iraq, that could have made things turn out differently.
Okay. And we've already that goes along with the question we've already asked. Switching to the presidents that were involved with the war, from in your opinion, what did John F. Kennedy do during the war to aid the war movement or change the way the war was going in Vietnam? Again, this will be probably after you were in college to what you understood.
The officially Vietnam did not start for us until about 1966, 1968. So JFK was dead.
Right.
He was not alive. As far as what he might have done early, he could have he was quite focused on Cuba and their tie to Russia. So he was kind of tied up on the southeast edge of our country with the Russians wanting to set up everything from battleships to nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. So he kind of had his hands full there. I think if he could have possibly spent a little bit more time with Vietnam, quelling anything that might have occurred there, or at least saying you need to stop, then that it may or may not have had an effect. With LBJ, I think LBJ kind of realized what mistakes had been made early on, and he did try to correct those. But by then, the Viet Cong were so entrenched that without the carpet bombing aspect, it was very, very hard to do.
Okay. And then, what do you think of Richard Nixon and how he handled the war?
I think he was left to pick up the pieces that LBJ and to a much lesser extent Kennedy had. And as we all know, Nixon was kind of stuck with his own problems. So yes. I guess to his credit, he did get us out of Vietnam. I think that's probably, even though the U.S. is known as never having lost a war, that's one that would go up in the tie column if we wanted to look at it like soccer, because in my mind and all the people I've talked to, many of the people I've talked to that have been there or studied it, in no way, shape, or form did the U.S. come out smelling like roses or with a win in the Asian theater for the Vietnam War. We kind of cut our losses and left.
Okay. And then what about how you think of Nixon after the Watergate scandal?
Um, I guess I have the opinion that all politicians have, or a vast majority of politicians have bones in their closet. His kind of fell out of the closet and stopped traffic.
Okay.
So we had no other recourse but to see what he had done, and it kind of showed how far um, our top officials will go to cover up what they've done and to prevent themselves from looking bad. I would liken that to this latest 2016 election and how it seems to be just kind of rolling along and boiling under the surface to the chagrin of the gentleman that won.
Okay. And then, based on what you've heard about the Vietnam War and then also World War II, since your father fought in World War II and was involved in World War II, what are the comparisons that you can make between the two wars?
I would say they're completely different. We're
Okay.
looking at, I say it again, we're looking at jungle warfare on a small peninsula involving the Chinese, the Russians, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, the
Okay.
U.S., Cambodian, and Laotian troops versus the whole world.
Okay.
World War II is fought on Pacific Islands, which would have been similar to that, but on much, much smaller scale. And then when you look at the European warfare, that was battled through cities and countryside which housed millions of people, and they had no choice but to either get out of the way or get run over, so to speak. We had World War II. There is no comparison. World War II is much, much bigger and much more devastating overall.
Okay. Um, and then did the war change the way you do anything in life?
Which war?
Either war.
I guess I'm kind of thankful that my father survived World War II, because myself and this fine young man sitting next to me are here as a result. I can't say that it changed anything for me.
Okay.
Through a good part of my life, I was a pretty selfish little kid and didn't really pay much attention to things. I will say that kind of brought to the front how overall mighty the U.S. is, because we were the main driving force to win World War II for us. I don't think Britain would have held on without our help. I think they eventually would have fallen. But it did also make a very strong Russia. We were very lucky to have them on our side. And then afterwards, they saw their opportunity and they scooped up the pieces of what was left of the Hitler regime, and that's what became known as the Iron Curtain. So we were, as a kid, we were very aware of the Iron Curtain and the war of words and flexing of muscles, so to speak, of the two big linebackers on the football team, so to speak, squaring off
Yeah.
with one another.
Okay. Let's see. Um, has either war, the World War II or Vietnam War, or any subsequent wars, changed your views on war and how we're involved or things we should do differently?
I would say yes. I don't like war. Um, I guess I'm a pacifist when it comes to that. I guess that's part of my left-leaning, some call liberal, but I call green views. I think there should always be a way out before we get to war, but we should also have strong defenses and the ability to go, okay, you've had your chance. Now you're going to suffer the consequences, so to speak. That sounds very harsh. Um, but if you look at the Middle East right now, spreading over into Afghanistan, there we're fighting a war of culture.
Okay.
And even though it's an extreme version of a culture, some would say that that's the way our country is going right now too. So I guess I'm more moderate in that I would like to see other solutions first.
And what might those solutions be that you would like to see?
I'm not saying kumbaya and I'll get along, but come to some type of solution, some diplomatic solution of I think ultimately, if our culture is to survive, we've all got to get along and we've all got to respect our views, our different views and religions of the planet. And how that goes about, I'm not a politician or a political scientist.
Okay. Um, well, drawing comparisons to um, soldiers in the Vietnam War and then even our modern wars right now, do you see any differences in the way that they were treated or how the media portrayed them or
Yes,
portrays them?
yes, definitely. I think uh, by and large, I won't even say generally, but by and large, the media portrayed the military, the soldiers in Vietnam, as not with the kindest light, because I think a lot of the media was against the war, and so they were taking their vengeance, so to speak, out on the soldiers. Where today, it seems like the media wants to portray us as having to fight that higher and mightier battle of extreme Islamic terrorism, and then our soldiers are held in a much higher light. And I know not all of it is extreme Islamic terrorism, but it's that far right leaning aspect of Islam that is getting the most airtime right now.
Okay. And then back to the Vietnam War, real quick. Um, the people who were protesting the war, and then the soldiers who fought in the war, after the war and after the soldiers came home, how did those two parties interact? Was there any animosity or any high tension between the two, or how was the interaction between the two groups?
I'd say on the contrary, I'd say that those coming back from Vietnam embraced the people that were protesting the war, because the people protesting the war were trying to get out the atrocities of the way we were treating our troops and the way we were treating our enemy to almost inhumane levels. And when you have somebody there that has firsthand experience of that, and they knew it was their job, but they absolutely disagreed with the protocols and policies in place, then they will naturally gravitate towards each other. I mean, I keep thinking as we do this, I go back to the movie Forrest Gump,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot of that. Yes, it's a fictional movie, but I think it fictionalizes a lot of our history, which is nonfiction. And um, there was a real pull near the end of the war and then after to gloss over what we had done to in Southeast Asia, but also to pull the covers back. So we had the governmental side and the pro, I hate to say pro war, but the pro war sides fighting against the um, those that were protesting, along with the ones that had come back and were giving firsthand accounts of what they saw, which was vastly different than what the general public was knowing. So there was a real battle within our country there of what we had done versus what the government wanted to let us know what we had done.
Okay.
I'd almost call it a cover up.
Okay. And then going along with that, Because of the government used the media as ways to get information out, how often did you hear about the war from the media? And then what particularly did you hear from the media about the war?
Well, this is back before the old interwebby thingy that we use now and love so dearly. So we relied on newspaper and and radio to a much lesser extent, but television. And living in Chicago at the time, we had this was back when we had the Sun Times and the Tribune. So, and I think at the time we mainly took the Tribune, but we did get it, and they were very good at getting stories out there. Again, I being 6 to 7 to 8, I couldn't read it very well, but anytime my oldest sister would come home, her future husband Ken had fought, and he didn't open up very much about it. So mainly those sources getting it out, but again, that was veiled under I think the guise of how much the government wanted to let out to the general public. So short of being at rallies and hearing firsthand, then that really wasn't known as easily as it is today with the internet.
Okay. Well, I think that about wraps up what we have here today. Thank you for your time. Any final thoughts you'd like to put in?
Um, Vietnam, it was a very bloody time in our history, very bad time. Um, I guess I've always taken the opinion that even if it makes you look like you have egg on your face, you should just tell the truth. And again, if I think if we would have approached this like we've got to go in and we've got to stop these atrocities now as quickly as possible, I think the public, while they might not have liked the fact that we were in a war, I think they would have been much more open and receptive to the fact that yes, we were trying to stop a very, very brutal communist dictatorship from taking over another part of the world. Um, it's not always easy being honest, but I think it's the way that you kind of need to go. I guess that's some utopian slash altruistic view, but um, why not? So,
All right. Well, thank you for your time.
thank you.
I think that's it.